All right, everyone. Welcome back to Paperboy Ventures Deals. I'm Kyle, your host and founder of Paperboy, and this is episode 2 of season 4. Quick refresher, season 4 is different from our first 3 seasons. We're now investing directly in every brand and founder that we bring on the pod. We're investing out of Paperboy Fund I, our first venture fund. Today's episode features a brand called Seatopia and founder James Arthur Smith, our second investment of the season. This one's a bit of a full circle moment. We actually had James on the pod a little over a year ago. And since then, all he's done is put his head down and build. The growth, product, team, traction, it's really been impressive to watch and is a huge reason why we invited him back on the show and made the investment. I'll leave it to James to tell the full story. But before we get into it, a quick word from our season 4 sponsor, Pelagic, the supply chain company. Pelagic is a team of experienced supply chain operators who work alongside emerging CPGs as their businesses grow. They specialize in building systems and scaling efficiently across key parts of the business like product manufacturing, inventory, and 3PL management, as well as general ops advisory. So if you're a founder or CPG ops leader and supply chain is holding you back, Pelagic can help. Reach out to them via their website and tell them Paperboy sent you. All right, without further ado, let's get to the episode introducing Seatopia and James Arthur Smith. Yeah, it's been a year since we last spoke, at least on the podcast, and I'll start by congratulating you. I think you're the second repeat guest that we've ever had on the Paperboy pod. So congratulations, James. How do you feel?
It's like when you reflect back on what can be accomplished versus what you think was going to be accomplished, it's always this confusion of like, we expect in the short term we get a lot done. You don't always get that, but you look back at the year and you're like, damn, we actually did a lot. So I'm proud of what's happened in the last year. We've matured a lot as a company and as an individual and individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're here to talk about that today. So we're gonna go through the past year of Seatopia and really what has developed over the past year, because I think there's some really impressive stories and things that are coming together around the business, and we'll chat through that. And for our listeners here, we had James on last March, and in that conversation, we talked all about his background and really why he's the right person to be building this company, Seatopia, and has the experience in the story. We covered all of that, so we're not going to do that today. What we're really going to focus on is the current state of the business at Seatopia, and I think James and team are solving a really interesting problem in the market. Really, to start the conversation, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the problems, because the seafood market as a consumer, I'll say, is one of the most confusing categories in the entire food landscape. Just in the past couple of weeks, I've seen articles that are wild caught is where you have to go. Oh, wait, there's pollution in the ocean, so no, farm raised is better. And then you see different perspectives in all different parts of the market. So really, I'm going to ask you a pretty broad question to begin, and we'll go into the full conversation from there. But in your opinion, James, what's the biggest problem in the seafood marketplace today?
The category is one of the last proteins that doesn't have clarity on quality. And when I think about ocean-derived seafood protein as a category, comparing it to land-based proteins, it doesn't have like a USDA prime, USDA quality. There's not inspectors at every processing facility that are grading it in the same way you have with seafood. You have a lack of detail and transparency, not just on sourcing, but in quality. I think that's one of the biggest problems. People in seafood are still buying based on mythology. The mythology is wild, or farmed, fresh, those don't actually tell you anything about the quality. Wild does not differentiate quality, toxicity, nutrient density. Fresh is such a vague terminology. Like, how long has it been fresh? How was it caught? Has a huge impact on the quality of that freshness, right? So I think as a categorically, it's just lacking a lot in gradation and still so overly commoditized. And it comes from a place of being optimized for cost and fast distribution. Because historically, before the advent of like super freezers, and also before the advent of like modern aquaculture practices, the majority of this huge global supply chain was optimized for very quick distribution of highly perishable fresh seafood. And that resulted in a system that's built on a lack of transparency where things get relabeled and mislabeled and sold through many, many hands before it finally gets to the customer. So it's just the wrong incentives to begin with. I would say that's like some of the biggest problems in seafood.
Yeah,
So there's
and
just like,
it sounds like that, I guess, is based around technology has been lagging. For some reason, the seafood category has lagged behind beef, even as a comp. But I guess why? Like, why do you think that is in seafood? Why has seafood been the last adopter of grading quality in the way that you do it today?
primarily because it's been sourced from boats that go out to sea for many days, weeks, or months at a time, are caught at various times via various methodologies, sometimes caught in abundance, like when a vessel would come across a breeding aggregation, and sometimes in much, and the supply side outnumbers the demand side, then the product might get relabeled or sold as something else or sold into another market. When there's not enough supply, same sort of problem. So there's just historically not been a consistent supply and a direct source. When you compare that to land-based agriculture, where we have step for step been producing more food in the United States, specifically like beef, chicken, we're actually a lot more connected and there's more transparency. In seafood, there's just a lack of transparency because inherently we've had a lot less consistent supply. And a concrete example of that is traditionally most seafood came from the wild. And since 2002, the supply of wild caught seafood plateaued. And since then, and it plateaued because we're not finding more seafood while there's still more and more demand, right? We're not finding a new pocket of the ocean with more tuna. We're, you know, having to substitute it with something else as certain fisheries fall off. How do we meet that growing demand? Generally, that's come from aquaculture, and farming, in theory, has the ability to produce more consistent supply. It still goes back to a problem, though, if the distribution of that farmed product was still super commoditizing the farmed products and not providing incentives, standardization of measurement on saying what is the difference in farming practices. Is it actually optimized for nutrient density, or is it just optimized to be cheap and potentially without a opacity or transparency on actually what type of farm, what type of species? So the industry is just built on a archaic distribution model that was optimized not for truth and transparency. It was optimized for moving fresh, highly perishable goods into a market and trying to find a buyer, and not a buyer who was optimizing for what is the nutrient density, what is the cleanliness, what is the veracity of actual statements. It was just like, is it still smell clean, or is it potentially going to make me sick? So like that, FDA does have some controls in place for seafood, but it's more about like safety. It's not about standardizations and measurement and quality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And to read that back, so basically the transparency problem exists, I would say, in part because we're also importing most of our seafood from far-reaching countries across the globe. So it lends itself probably to just an industry that's harder to track versus stuff that's homegrown here. And you also mentioned how wild caught plateaued in, was it 2002 or
2002. Yeah.
right? And that's, you know, you can't really go out and produce more wild caught, right? Because we're overfishing, we are decimating supply. I think the simplest way to put it is we probably maxed out on wild caught. Would you say that
Yeah,
that's true?
that's correct. That's an accurate statement. Yeah. The sustainable yield has plateaued. And now we, the only growing uh, industries in wild caught fisheries are going into the Arctic and trying to get permission to mine krill, which I think is a really bad idea. Krill is the foundational piece of entire food webs. In fact, it could be considered the foundation of the entire blue planet. But if you look at tuna or pollock or cod or any of the large commodities that have built entire communities, cities, industries, they've all plateaued and or are constraining because of maxed out sustainable yield and increasing pressure and problems with toxicity in those environments. I mean, a famous marine biologist, Sylvia Earle, recently said there is no excess in the ocean in nature, and like there is a balanced partner in nature, the symbiotic relationships. You can't just take krill out of the ocean and expect that the organisms that normally would have eaten that krill are just fine, right? Like all of a sudden, whales and penguins and all these other species, the ripple effect is measurable. It's just difficult from a scientific perspective in a single season to quantify what those impacts are. We are beyond that tipping point of just continuing to extract more. We're at the point now where global scientists are necessitating that are stating that it's necessary for us to produce more seafood to meet global demands for DHA and EPA. And it goes back to the idea, like we're talking about a global commodity, but it's not really just a a nice thing, right? Like all humans have something, have a dependency on essential fatty acids that derive from marine environments. And that is a truth that can't be ignored. You can't just get chia seeds or plant-based omegas, ALA, to meet the global need for DHA because of the conversion ratio. You can't just consume enough plant-based omega-3s to meet the necessary requirements of like a toddler or a developmental fetus to have the DHA needs. All of those DHA needs are greater than what you can just get from plant-based. So either you're supplementing with microalgae or you're getting it from fish oil that is coming from the oceans. So
Yeah. Right.
yeah, we're in
And
a
we'll get into DHA and EPA, and I want to define what that is for those who don't know as well. But to go back to the problems, we hit on wild caught, and we started to get into aquaculture and farming. And is aquaculture the same thing as farming in your mind, or can you define those two? Draw a difference between the two.
yeah, of course. I mean, aquaculture is simply the cultivation of aquatic life. So it could be for consumption, it could also be for pharmaceuticals, or it could be for restorative regeneration practices, and it could be all of the above in examples of um, multi-trophic aquaculture, growing multiple different species that serve different needs and have different ecosystem services while also being consumable. Yeah, the ocean has been farmed for centuries in different formats. Things like traditional extensive aquaculture done in China, raising carp and integrating them into the rice paddies, the symbiotic relationship between the carp in the rice paddies and how they benefit both organisms. In Hawaii, the traditional fish ponds. In cultures around the world, aquaculture has been practiced in ways that are what we call extensive aquaculture, that have healthy balance. And then you have intensive aquaculture, which is optimized for profit with a lot of externalities on nutrition. And that has generally been scaled through the same private equity groups that own large
Yep.
industrial scale land-based agriculture systems. And that model is not what we're condoning with what we've been working on, because that again just is a result of
Profit
the lack
and efficiency,
and
right?
the misaligned incentives, right? A system that rewards cheapest production, not best quality. And all of these intermediaries that are needed to distribute product that doesn't have transparency, that doesn't have uh, differentiation on quality, going back to like the fact that there's not like an equivalent of the USDA grading for seafood. So there's no standards. You have this lack of opacity and misaligned incentives. It resulted in a lot of farms optimizing for industrial scale practices, not factoring in or optimizing for nutrient density or environmental benefit.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad you drew the distinction between quality aquaculture, intensive aquaculture, and I think we'll get to what Seatopia does in a few minutes here. But just since the last time we spoke, I think a great example of intensive, we had the great shrimp recall here in the U.S. There were 58 million pounds of shrimp that were recalled in August of last year. And I was just reading about it before our recording. It's fascinating how they caught what was in there. And I don't know if you know this story, but it wasn't the FDA because as you mentioned, the checkpoints, I think they checked 2% of imports. And it was actually our US Customs and Border Protection who caught it because they were using radioactive scanners designed to stop nuclear terrorism.
Yeah.
And that's how they found the radioactive content of the shrimp, which was caused, I believe, it was in Indonesia, and there was a smelter close by the biggest production plant for shrimp, and it bled into all that product. So it's incredible for that to on that scale for it to happen, and it just started to open my eyes more to what you do.
Yeah, it speaks again to the idea that there's not gradations of quality, right? They weren't testing for quality. And even like the indication of like, okay, they found radioactive materials, but that speaks nothing to the fact that the majority of Americans who report of having like an allergy to shellfish, it's not actually, typically the majority of those people are showing that they're actually having an allergic reaction to the chemical additives that a lot of these processing facilities are putting into the shrimp to make it look fresher, taste fresher, right? Like the sulfates and the sulfate carbonates, sulfate is not necessary to preserve the shellfish. It's only being added because they didn't have a healthy environment to begin with. They didn't have the proper cold chain to begin with. And that's oftentimes what people are getting allergic reactions to. There's so much lack of education, nuance, and gradation and standardization in seafood. And that's like the big problem, is that it's the Wild West. And historically, it was coming through many, many channels from various locations, distributed through a bunch of resellers and relabeled depending on who was willing to buy it.
Yeah, and I think that it sets us up to get into what Seatopia does nicely. And I know we talked about that a lot on our last podcast, but would love, before we get into what's happened in the past year, because I know a lot has developed with your business and even on the shrimp front. So we'll talk about that. But can you just speak to, in summary, how you approach aquaculture at Seatopia and what you look for to actually work with a farm that meets your standards, and how it's different to how most aquaculture is done from an import seafood basis today?
So I think about it through the perspective of how do we build food systems that are scalable and nutritious. And when I think about the problems of scalability, I think about finite resources being not scalable. So, one thing that's not scalable is fish oil and fish meal. And any farm that is 100% dependent on fish oil and fish meal has a existential long-term problem, right? Like you can't scale a business infinitely if the ocean has demonstrated that there's a finite uh, maximum sustainable yield of that. So how do we evolve that? Well, there are some feed sources that are scalable. Things like microalgae can be grown and produced in aquaculture to produce highly scalable, highly nutritious nutrients for seafood and for human consumption. So it's worth just backing up for a minute and saying that all seafood is dependent on microalgae. So fish don't produce omega 3s. Omega 3s come from microalgae that then bioaccumulate into fish. So when farms are feeding fish oil and fish meal to seafood, it's generally because they need a balance of nutrients. And one of the most important ones is DHA. And DHA is coming from microalgae. And you cannot continue to scale seafood production just grinding up bait fish, forage fish, anchovetas from the ocean. And the largest fishery in the world by tonnage is the Peruvian anchoveta fishery, of which the majority of it goes to aquaculture. And that fishery, as one example that can be applied to many examples of fisheries around the world, has been very volatile. From year to year, the maximum sustainable yield quota has changed based on what scientists are finding as sustainable yield. And there's been years, 2 years ago, as an example, when the fishery was completely closed for the entire year because there was not enough. What happened? A lot of farms switched to microalgae, which was previously more expensive, but also more scalable, available, can be funded and grown and to produce higher yields and more producers. And as economies of scale improve, the price of that microalgae comes down and it becomes more and more competitive to wild caught. So when I think about aquaculture, I think holistically, like what is the problem we're trying to solve? We're trying to solve changing our relationship to the blue planet to actually be regenerative as opposed to, or at least truly sustainable as opposed to extractive. And it's kind of the same thing that you could say happened with land-based agriculture years ago. Like we stopped hunting buffalo when we ran out of buffalo and we started farming cattle. And that has allowed us to produce total gross production in larger quantities. And then the nuance happens in how it's farmed, what it's fed, and the gradation and the quality through the USDA and through testing for nutrient density allows optimization and incentive towards better farming practices. So I'm thinking about aquaculture through not just how do we produce more, but how do we produce something that's actually scalable. And that's what we're trying to do, is identify the farming practices and align incentives to optimize for something that's nutrient dense, scalable, better for humans, better for the fish, better for the environment. And the really interesting, cool, and fulfilling part about this is that what's better for the environment is also better for the fish. And what's better for the fish is also better for humans. Like, who,
Right. It's
it,
pretty symbiotic, and it's also very simple when you put it that way. The better the farming practices, the better the quality of the fish, the better the nutrition for the human. And if you can do it in that regenerative, sustainable way, I mean, that's the gold standard. While of course making a profit as a for-profit business.
yeah, it
In
has to be profitable
has to be
for the
for
businesses, for the farms to scale. They have to be financially incented with a financial incentive to
right.
grow.
In when you talk about farming practices, it sounds like it really boils down to feed is one of the most important aspects of
Mhm.
that. I would say the environment as
Mhm.
well. So like where the species are housed. Can you talk about you talked about microalgae? I think there's insect proteins as well. Like
Mhm.
how do you think about the feed side of it? And then if you could also speak to the environments and how you evaluate those in the farms you work with.
I think it's worth sharing an example of a project that was demonstrated where in a university that steelhead trout, as one example, could be raised on a feed that was truly scalable and nutrient dense. And the university showed that these steelhead trout could be farmed using insect protein, which is a species appropriate part of the natural diet of steelhead trout, rainbow trout, salmon. All these salmonids eat insects throughout their life cycle. In particular, they're only eating insects when they're up in the rivers and the lakes, are primarily eating insects. So they're insectivores. When you feed them insect protein that is produced in a truly scalable environment, you're getting them nutrients that are aligned to their natural diet and are scalable. The other thing that they need is a rich source of DHA. And instead of using a finite resource from the oceans, producing microalgae through cultivation in similar method to brewing yeast or making beer or whatever, actually growing microalgae, giving those oils and proteins directly to the fish, you can produce a healthy, nutrient dense fish that is demonstratedly more nutrient dense, cleaner, and scalable than traditional farmed or even wild caught, because you can optimize the diet to have more DHA and less exposure to mercury and microplastics. That has been done and was done 20 years ago. When I was a kid, I was exposed to the idea of regenerative aquaculture. When I was a teenager volunteering at an aquarium, why has it not scaled? Goes right back to your original question. It primarily hasn't scaled because the incentives were not there. And the distributors did not have a way to differentiate on quality if they were just optimizing for price. And if the distributors simply said species and country of origin is what determines price, there's no incentive for farms to actually scale those projects. Seatopia exists as a methodology to provide financial incentive for scaling production that results in quantifiably higher levels of DHA, balanced omega 6, omega 3 ratios, zero detectable microplastics, and levels of mercury that are low enough for a pregnant woman to consume 7 days a week. And this is only achievable if the feed is better, lower in exposures to toxins, higher in the nutrients, demonstrated in a third-party lab test, and front and center on the label. And then consumers develop the lexicon to choose seafood based on what's actually healthier as opposed to just what's fresh or wild caught, because those mythologies don't differentiate on quality. And that's what we're
No,
doing here
it's
is,
yeah, it's been up for a long time. It's just been wild caught, farm raised, and then you're just, you know, you guess
yeah,
from there and you
yeah.
pick and choose. But the consumer side is really interesting. I think what you brought up around the feed hitting a point of scale and lowering costs as scale rises is important. But I would argue it's probably just as important the state of the consumer and how, at least in the U.S., everyone is now demanding more transparency from the food and beverage products that they consume and bring into their household every day. And you see new startup brands are bringing this out from water. You've got Lunin Water who's coming out and doing something similar, and the Lineage protein bars are doing that. And to my knowledge, you're the first one to do this in seafood. But the consumer sentiment is certainly something that is helping, and I'm sure that you're seeing that more as you grow the business. And I think this is a good point to go to what's really happened over the past year. And I'll set the stage. You've now managed to you've doubled the business every year since 2022, and it grows daily. Your retention metrics are great. Clearly you're hitting some sort of a product market fit. But there's a lot to talk about over what's happened in the past 12 months. I'll just give you the floor. What are you seeing out there? What has really changed over the past 12 months?
I would say in the last 12 months, the conversation of food, whole foods being medicine, and the optimization of or prioritization of healthy food for the mainstream consumer, not just the niche, has been unlike anything that I would have expected or seen. And it's a wave that we were already riding that's just growing as we go down the line. Um, and that's a good feeling. um, it's a good feeling because we've been, in some cases, like swimming against the current for years. Um, yes, we've grown. We've more than doubled the last, since 2022, but we were also growing before that, just not necessarily as rapidly. Um, it's all of the investment that we've done lab testing our products. We're the only brand in the world lab testing for mercury and microplastics and nutrient density. And like the Seatopia standard of everything that we test for is far beyond what anyone else is doing. And in some ways, that was ahead of the curve, kind of a big investment, bit of a reach, but it was to build veracity and data and justify this and the differentiated story, not story, differentiated quality of better farming practices, right? Like we wanted to prove that these better farming practices not only were producing healthier fish and reducing impact on the environment, increasing biodiversity, like that part of the triangle, let's call it, has been demonstrated that you can produce fish, seafood in healthier manner that's better for the environment. Like there's tons and tons of case studies on the environmental impact. Now we're also demonstrating through lab testing that those same practices result in fish that are more nutrient dense and cleaner. And the third thing that's happening right now in the market is that people are starting to take their own biomarker testing. And now we're actually seeing people come to us, whether they're like a member of Function Health or any other sort of concierge health and they actually know what their omega index is. They know what their levels of mercury are. Their doctors are referring them to Seatopia. Their nutritionists, their health coaches are referring to Seatopia. And then they're tracking that over time. Because traditionally, a nutritionist, a functional medicine doctor might feel that seafood is healthier and have a assumption that eating more seafood is going to help them increase the levels of DHA, but they don't actually know for sure how much is in a portion because the FDA nutrition facts panels are literally like 20 years old. They're referencing numbers that aren't relative to the specific region where that fish was caught or how it was raised. We are testing batches of seafood and have it tied directly to detailed nutrition facts, not just reference tables that are 20 years old.
Yeah.
That allows people to dose themselves. And then if they're testing their biomarkers, see efficacy in how those biomarkers change. We have customers who are buying seafood not just because it's convenient and delicious and makes them feel like a badass in the kitchen and they invite their friends over and make a sushi meal, but they also have seen on their biomarkers in Function Health or any of the different platforms where they're seeing omega indexes going up, and they have this knowledge about the value of an omega index above 8 being associated with living longer, reducing cardiac risk. 5 years longer health spans are associated to omega indexes over 8. This data being understood and then being able to action with dosing seafood that has quantifiable nutrients in it and quantifiably less exposure to toxins, they're also seeing their mercury levels go down. And that traditionally was the paradox, was like, I mean, you recently had a child, like your wife was probably recommended to increase her DHA, but be careful of mercury. So maybe just take supplements. But then there's also like concerns for people who are on blood thinners or have heart arrhythmia or might be bleeding to not have high dose DHA omega-3s. But that same data is, or that same assumption is, uh, that same concern is invalidated when people are given high doses of whole fish, because whole fish have pro-resolving mediators. They have all the micronutrients. They allow the bioavailability. It's a huge difference between supplementation and whole food, right? Our bodies evolved to have all these nutrients that work symbiotically that allow us to digest it and utilize it. And that's a big difference between like feeling burpy after you take some fish oil supplement versus eating sushi and you just feel sharp and like it just assimilated. That you can do that now with seafood that has a lab test that quantifies that this was tested at zero point 0.1 parts per million of mercury or less and has 3,000 milligrams of DHA and EPA. And then if your goal is to have an omega index over 8, you know that you want to be getting on average 2,000 milligrams a day and you're tracking your biomarkers. This is happening now. Customers have the culture, the American people are starting to care more, and this information is becoming more available, and the um, accessibility of at-home biomarker testing has made it more approachable. All these things are helping grow the
Yeah.
wave.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think some of what you said is definitely on the niches and the tracking
Yeah.
omega indexes and all of that. But it is rising with the Brian Johnsons of the world blowing up all over the internet, and there's more awareness brought to longevity and health span and surviving as long as possible every day. But I do think the way to win big is break through to the mainstream consumer. And in my opinion, the best way to do that is to do what you're doing now, which is provide the highest quality seafood that's in the market. It tastes better than anything that's out there. And you test it for chemicals, microplastics, and now nutrient density. And the last time we had you on, you were testing for chemicals and microplastics. I don't believe you were testing for nutrient density yet. Is that right?
We were, but only the omega fatty acid profile. And now we're testing for just a wide swath of nutrients. So you have your selenium levels, your vitamin B12, your choline, all these things that are like very important and beneficial, especially for like pregnancy and athletes. What are those levels in fish that, and specific species of fish or specific like salmon roe caviar? Why is that a superfood? Because of the levels of B12, of choline, of these other nutrients combined with the highest levels of DHA that make like one spoonful of salmon roe caviar one of the most nutrient dense foods on the planet. Like having that data allows us to evolve from just telling stories to actually like, is this actually a superfood, right? Like, or is it just story? Like, not
Yeah,
all
you can
foods
prove
are
it out.
medicine, right? But what foods are medicine? And
Yeah.
that's yeah, the full spectrum panel is, we're learning so much as well. We're learning a lot, which is kind of exciting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, and I know, so your two biggest product lines are probably salmon and shrimp. So let's go back to the shrimp side of things, and it probably depends on the species what you're testing, right? Can you just paint the picture? Like, how do you do that? Do you do that on site for shrimp, and then what are you really looking for?
There are some tests that are done on site. There are some tests that are done in the United States. There's some that are closer to the source. There's things that are being tested like histamines, like at the farm on a regular basis, and that has more to do with like safety and quality and freshness. And then there's things like the levels of DHA and EPA and ALA or omega 6s. And what we're doing there is less about, so there's some things that we're testing that are just like, is it clean? Right? Like microplastics. And what we learned with microplastics with shrimp is really interesting, that like, even if you go to the most pristine environments in the world, like whether you're in like every water source in Alaska that was tested for microplastics was positive, right? Like microplastics are everywhere. So how do you produce fish, seafood that don't have microplastics? Well, you kind of can't. But we're selling seafood that doesn't have microplastics in it, or have been tested and have zero detected microplastics. Well, we're only selling parts of fish, and there are parts of fish that we cannot sell. An example is, we don't sell the intestines of fish because what's happening with microplastics, they're concentrating in the digestive tract of fish. So we don't currently sell sardines and anchovies that have, you know, microplastics in the stomach cavity. We don't currently sell mussels or oysters because you can't separate the digestive tract from the part you eat. We do sell scallops because you can separate the adductor muscle from the roe and all the rest. Shrimp, it's interesting. You can take out the digestive tract, but what we also found is that there's a lot of microplastics accumulating in the shell. Who would have guessed that the shell is actually is utilizing those microplastics or concentrating those microplastics? We only found that, there wasn't like a bunch of studies. This wasn't like common knowledge before we started studying this. But even in the most remote regions where we assumed that this was such a pristine environment that there wouldn't be microplastics, there was microplastics when you took a whole shrimp and ground it up, or even remove the digestive tract and ground it up. But when you took the shell off, you could get the same shrimp and show zero detected microplastics.
Right.
So what we learned from that is like, A, microplastics are everywhere. B, they're accumulating in certain anatomy. And C, you can then give guidance to people to, hey, like maybe don't make a bisque anymore, because traditionally like a taking the shell off or cooking in the shell added flavor, and then you would take the bisque and make like a shrimp or lobster bisque with the shells. We're
Right.
learning, we're evolving, and yeah, and shrimp also, like whether it's the the sulfates, the different chemical preservatives, these are things that you have to ensure are not in them before you bring them into the United States, because it's a pain in the ass to have to, like, we have very strict um, purchase order clauses that say if something comes into our warehouse and then we send it to the laboratory and verify that there is something that doesn't meet our standards, we will reject it. And then our partners would have to figure out what they want to do with it. And oftentimes it's easy for them to sell it to somebody else who doesn't care whether or not that's in there, but that's on those other people. What matters to us is that we don't sell anything that doesn't meet the Seatopia standard. And that means zero detected microplastics. That means levels of mercury that are safe below zero point 0.1 parts per million. That means a balance of omega 3 to omega 6. And that is important to us because the common American diet gets way too many omega 6s, but also it's important to the fish and the sea life because omega 6s are generally not the thing that the organisms are healthiest on. An example with fish is if you feed the most affordable aquaculture feed to fish, it's probably going to come from subsidized GMO corn and soy, so canola oil, rapeseed oil, and soy protein. Yes, that's less expensive, but it's going to show up on the omega-6, omega-3 testing. And what that indicates to me is that they were using canola oil instead of using algae oil. So we hold the farms accountable, we hold the feed mills accountable by having this test. And that's a really important thing. By testing for this, we can hold them accountable that nobody's changing something behind the scenes. And we get something that's healthier for us. But guess what? It's also healthier for the animals. Because if you probably heard of fatty liver disease. It's like an inflammation of the liver because it's overloaded with unprocessable fats. Guess what? The same thing is happening in aquaculture farms where they're feeding them the canola oils, the seed oils, the soy oils. It's not to say that some ALA, some canola oil or soy protein is bad, but it is not appropriate to have the concentrations be out of line, because I'm not like hard against soy or corn as long as it's free of glyphosate, free of antibiotics, free of these things that are not going to be digestible or poisonous. But we also know that the average American is getting way too much of those seed oils. And we know that what the body actually needs are the essential fatty acids in the form of DHA, the omega-3s. And that's what we're trying to optimize for, is what are the fewest analytes we can test for that have the biggest impact on changing the incentive model on how fish are raised in order to achieve a food system that's scalable and nutritious and in symbiotic partnership with the planet that we live on.
Well summarized. And as you lay all that out, what are you learning about the customers that are coming to Seatopia? Who are these people? Where are you finding them? How are you growing the customer base?
um, I'll say we're not finding them by just putting up an ad and saying like cheap fish or like 30% off seafood. Like what we're doing is ensuring that the data becomes the reference point, that Seatopia is the reference, not the ad, right? Like if we have the most thorough testing, we're developing trust. And that's what's really cutting through this. Like people are coming to us because they're referred by their functional medicine doctor, nutritionist, health coach. Like this is showing up in post-purchase surveys. And those nutritionists are coming to us because they either read a study, they read the data, or they were referred by another functional medicine doctor. So sometimes we do long form educational podcasts. Sometimes we're publishing papers, guides in collaboration with nutritionists. This is the educational piece that is kind of a slower but building snowball. And this is very different than traditional customer acquisition. Yes, we do customer acquisition on Meta and Google and things of that nature, but like we have really clear guidance that, if you're going to make a statement like clean seafood, we validate it with the data, because it's not storytelling. This is data driven. Like, what does that mean? It means zero detectable microplastics. It means less than 0.1 parts per million of mercury. If we're going to say omega rich, we're going to quantify that with exactly how many milligrams of DHA and EPA are in there. And this is helping change the way people think about buying seafood from, traditionally people would just say, what is the price per pound, to like, what is the price per milligram of bioavailable nutrients that are associated with the health benefits of eating seafood. And those are like the DHAs and the EPA. And when that is front and center, and when people can make a buying decision based on which one actually is the richest source of those nutrients, We have an incentive program that actually is incentivizing better practices and better for the planet and better for people. And that's what we're doing with the lab testing, with the nutrient testing, with human biomarkers, is helping people make those decisions. And so we're getting customers through like education channels, I guess is one way to say it.
Yeah, it's a tough. I was thinking about it before this. It's a tough call on how much time and energy and focus you put on straight customer acquisition versus almost like long-term brand building and educational content. And you have such a compelling story and background to what you're doing, but it's not something that is easily communicated like that on shelf. I think you have that ability just based on the product quality and the taste. And even if people don't know what the full backstory is, I think you have a path to the mainstream consumer just purely on that. And if you haven't tried the shrimp yet, try it. It's outrageous. It tastes more like lobster than it does like traditional shrimp. But the acquisition strategy is really intriguing, and I think we were talking even before the recording, hiring a marine nutrition advisor, and it seems like your goal seems to be the authority in this space and build the highest quality product and let people discover it that way. If that sounds
Yeah.
right, but
Yeah, no, that's really what we're doing, is focusing on building the most trusted brand in marine nutrition. And we're doing that through all the lab testing, through all the studies. And we become the reference, not the ad, right? Like, yes, we are doing ads. Yes, we do partnerships. Yes, we've done podcasts, and we will continue to do more of that. And front and center on our label, we're putting the nutrients, and that's helping, like, on shelf. We, just to be clear, at the moment we're all direct to consumer. Is there opportunity for us to grow into other categories? Absolutely. Like, the most trusted brand in seafood has huge applications across direct to consumer, across retail, and into the broader categories of marine nutrition, whether that's omega-3 supplements or marine collagens. When we have a very clear roadmap and plans to launch those products this year in a small way. But what matters first is that we're differentiated, and trusted in a category that is historically confusing, is both the challenge and the opportunity, and nobody else has done this because it is a very complicated and difficult category, but that also is part of the moat, right? Like, it takes a lot to change a food system. Like, it takes a lot to simply change the feed that goes into a farm. But then you also have to figure out the packaging, the logistics, the distribution, the trust, brand, the ambassadors. Like, there's so many components to this that make it very, very difficult to get as far as we have. But also, this is the opportunity. This is kind of what's exciting and fun, is doing hard things that are worthwhile.
yeah, my next question was going to be what makes this difficult to replicate? And I think you sort of answered it there, but I was just like, why aren't other D to C or not seafood providers testing for chemicals and nutrient density? And what's stopping them from replicating what you're doing?
Primarily because most of them are still selling all the oil that's in the ground. They're still selling petroleum cars, right? Like, when you go and, you know, it's going to be a long time um, before they are forced to make a decision, because there's still a lot of demand for wild caught seafood. And if your whole business model, or the majority of your revenue, is coming from wild caught seafood, to now start testing and providing transparency on microplastics, on mercury, on the nutrient density, all of a sudden creates a potential liability for, or how your product compares to other better products. So might mean that those products all of a sudden have to sell for less or sell for more. And it definitely changes the whole market. And I think that's a big risk for most incumbent distribution systems. Entire supply chains, communities, and industries are built on opaque distribution of commodity products that consumers wouldn't be interested in or as interested in if they knew the levels of mercury, or that they knew that there was microplastics in it, or they knew that it was mostly seed oils and not, the right balance of omega-6 to omega-3s. This information is our moat because we've done the hard work of selling the harder product. It's harder to sell farmed seafood, not because farmed seafood can't be done right, but because most of the traditional commodity seafood was done incorrectly and it has a stigma. We are overcoming this stigma and doing the hard work of differentiating the quality and making it very clear that this is not commodity seafood. How do I know it's how do consumers know it's not commodity seafood? Because you can see more omega-3s than omega-6s, because you can see the levels of microplastics that are not in the product. You can see the levels of mercury, you can see the choline, the B12, all the other micronutrients that only occur in fish that are fed a better diet. And it's it's gonna require, there will be a reckoning as consumers continue to demand better products. And that's the goal, the mission of Seatopia, is to change the industry in the same way that consumers have demanded better cattle. It's changed the supply. There's more farmers implementing regenerative practices today because people are demanding more nutrient dense cattle. They're not just saying they want it because it's better for the environment. They're saying they want the one that actually is healthier for themselves, and that's changing the supply. And over time, the retailers, the brands are evolving. We just happen to be, I've been in this for 12 years working on this, trying to fix the supply side, uh, and, realizing that it's the demand that needs to evolve, and that having the incentives in place to align those. And that's what we're doing through Seatopia.
Yeah, it's both, and I think if this is the next big thing, you'll hit both at the same time. And the supply side is really interesting as well. Do you think the supply side is ready? Is it ready for aquaculture to explode in the way that you're talking about it? Because it has to take more land. It has to, if you're going to reduce the density of every species that you're farming, you need more space, you need more feed. Where are we at in, making that shift overall?
Do you need to eat more food if one is more nutrient dense, right? You're more satiated, right? Like if you're just getting corn fed versus getting like actual nutrient dense. So I think that's a bit of a hypothetical question, but in reality, what we're seeing is large scale farms making bets in converting a portion of their concession. Like a lot of the large farms, they might have 100 different concessions or farm sites. And what they're doing with Seatopia is they're saying, we want to work with you and develop a better product, because there's no marine biologist that gets into aquaculture with the goal of producing the cheapest seafood in the world. Every marine biologist comes into aquaculture through the lens of, how do I be a good steward of the ocean? How do I help change our relationship with the ocean, and advance ocean conservation and make seafood more sustainable? And then they get pushed down by the market that says, we're only going to reward price. There's not really a market for something more innovative. If you can do innovative and make it cheap and competitive to the GMO antibiotic stuff, great. But that hasn't happened yet because there wasn't a differentiation in valuing those better products. So what's happening now with the farms that we're working with is either there are small farms that were super artisan and are fully on board with a commitment to what we call Aquaculture 3.0, or they're on the journey and they're allocating a lot or a smaller section of their farm that is isolated and has a different feed, and they're committing to, we will invest in utilizing more microalgae, more insect protein to, if you can pay us more. And we're like, yeah, of course, that's our model. We will pay you more. And if you do more and do a full replacement, we will pay you even more, this, but without clear incentives for more DHA, more selenium, more antioxidants in the form of astaxanthin, there hasn't previously been that incentive for them to change. So they're starting to change. Like there are farms that we're working with today that didn't previously have an outlet for their product in the United States that or anywhere in the world, that were told by retailers and distributors that the market isn't ready for those pilot ideas, those innovative projects. Just try to make it cheaper and we'll buy more. And we are supporting those projects and growing because we're actually quantifying and placing value on the nutrient density, the quality of the nutrition, not just the story or the mythology of wild versus farmed, or,
Yeah.
like
And
so much
and
greenwashing.
yeah, and the consumer is coming around to it as well. I think the number one Netflix show right now is a documentary on microplastics.
Wow.
So, it's happening. We're in the midst of a cultural wave where people are putting way, way, way more um, not confidence. They're just putting way more of a focus on the makeup and the supply chain and where things are coming from, as people trust pharmaceuticals less and start to look at food as medicine. So it is a really interesting time to be doing
Yeah.
this. I know you've basically dedicated your life. This is your life's work. But outside looking in, it does seem like we're hitting some points of a cultural wave.
It feels like it. Feels that, yeah. Like in surfing, there are certain places in the world where a wave will start small and it'll grow as it goes down the line. Like the way that the bathymetry of the ocean is, and the wave just concentrates, and we're feeling that. I'm feeling like multiple different factors contributing to growing support, demand. Like I don't feel like we are pushing the ball uphill anymore. I feel like we are literally like surfing, navigating, like, and gaining momentum, because there's more people that are interested. There's more institutes that want to get involved in helping us do studies. There's like high profile celebrities that are proactively reaching out to us and posting about us.
You're on the
It
Paperboy podcast twice.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
right. That's
there's some
right.
big things
Huge.
happening. But no, it's a great segue to the last part of this conversation. I know you've been on this idea in one way or another for a long time now. Would love if you could walk us through in your mind what the next year looks like in the short term, and then we can close on long term and what success looks like for Seatopia, when it's all said and done.
One of the things I'm most excited about right now is incorporating the biomarker data into the Seatopia portal, so that we're going to start sending out omega index tests to subscribers. So when you subscribe, you'll actually get a test kit that you can at home test your the mercury level, or excuse me, the omega levels in your blood. You send it off to the laboratory, and then via API, that data shows up in your portal. So when you log in to track your orders, you can not only see like how many boxes you've ordered, but we're going to also be able to show you what your omega index was when you started, and then how it's evolved over time. So your Seatopia portal becomes the place that you're actually looking at your biomarker data and seeing the efficacy of Seatopia. So I'm super excited about that, because it's just reaffirming this theory of change, and and tying the the consumptive behavior to measurable outcomes in people's health, and that's super exciting. I'm excited just to put more energy into sharing the Seatopia standard and studies that are demonstrating this theory of change and how, better practices and results in healthier fish and healthier humans, and, doing some actual quantitative randomized studies and getting that data out there. Um, and I'm excited that we're gonna have a expanded product line that gets us into shelf stable products by the end of the year. That's we're not we're not going away from being the most trusted brand in seafood, but we are expanding to be the most trusted brand in marine nutrition.
Great. And we won't get into the product specifics now. I did want to ask you about the go to market, because you did bring up, I know, 100% direct to consumer today. I think it's not a big leap to start thinking about retail. And I know in our last conversation we talked about the problems with grocery store seafood and thawing and leaving frozen fish, thawing it, putting it on ice, and just the practices today are pretty ridiculous, and are not in the best interest of the people who are eating the product. So you've got retail eventually, restaurants. I believe that's how the idea sort of started. What's your mindset on route to market and the focus on D2C versus these other channels?
Well, before I was doing Seatopia, you may recall I had an energy bar spelled, called Quinoa Decadence, spelled with a K, and we built that to nationwide distribution, Whole Foods. And so I've done that in the past, and I didn't want to uh, replicate some of the challenges and lessons that we had there with Seatopia, and that was like going into retail and distributors with brokers and paying the slotting fees and trying to like do that growth mindset. I believe that retail will happen when there's enough pull that we don't have to pay a single slotting fee, and that the consumers and those buyers are demanding the product. In the interim, Seatopia has huge opportunity ahead of us just in direct to consumer, and we will tiptoe into the image accounts, the really high profile ones that build brand while also expanding our footprint until it's just we are ubiquitous and demanded. Um, we'll also, I don't want to just be in the frozen category buried in a top loading freezer. Like I think the merchandising of Seatopia, if the goal is to change the conversation from price per pound to price per milligram of bioavailable nutrients. I think it's more like the supplement aisle and the health section of the grocery store, where I would envision seeing Seatopia, where people are thinking about buying the Seatopia product, not in comparison to buying commodity fish, but they're thinking about it, well, should I be eating supplements or should I be eating whole fish? And if I pick up a bottle of supplements and I see how many milligrams per serving of DHA versus a piece of a Seatopia product, maybe the conversation starts to make more sense and the decision is going to be different, like delicious sushi grade versus like burpee supplements. Like that is the conversation that we want our customers to be having. We also want shelf stable products to be right there, and the expansion of the product category into shelf stable products allows Seatopia to kind of get into different use cases, whether you're traveling or whatnot. So we can. I don't want to share too much about what we're in product development on right now, but yeah, our friends at Lineage and our friends at Equip and some of these other brands that we really look up to and have developed great rapport with are good examples of the integrity in which I think is necessary if you're going to have a CPG product.
Yeah, and I was kind of smiling as I was thinking about David Protein, and say what you will about their product and all of that, but when they launched cod, I think it was last year at this point, and it just blew up everywhere, and it was eat you get the same amount of protein in a piece of cod as a David bar. Uh, Excellent marketing campaign, but it brings up an interesting question of the supplements industry is completely exploding. All of these products are, you see Mars Men raised $30 million yesterday, and there's a different brand every day that does. if you can get the same supplemental quality through Whole Foods, seafood, why not? And it's in a better form anyways. So that's how I think about it,
And
at least.
this is such a fun piece of the conversation. I mean, a little insider baseball. Before they launched COD, they wanted Seatopia to do the sourcing and vetting and a potential collaboration on launching a COD product. I worked on it with them for 3 months and could not source for them a product that met our standards.
What, really? So is cod just a species that is tough for aquaculture, or what was the issue?
Yeah, tough for aquaculture, tough to say no, detectable microplastics, zero, safe levels of mercury, and the right balance of omega-3s to omega-6s. Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
So,
Love it. I didn't
and,
realize
and
that you were working on that
yeah,
a bit.
yeah, I have some insider baseball on that one. It's also worth noting that I, not to say that we're the smartest ones in the room, but I shared with them what's working with Seatopia is the lab testing and whatnot. And when they launched with that cod product, yeah, they tested for, it says like tested by light labs, but it doesn't really say what they're testing for, and are the things that they're testing for really the things that matter. So it's one thing to say you're testing, it's another thing to actually disclose what you're testing for and have those things be the things that actually are important. Um,
Yeah, and
yeah,
this is a whole other topic, but you see like there's watchdog groups now, even on like X, that they'll pick up a product and they'll test it and then they'll
as
post
they
it and
should.
it'll go
Yeah,
viral. And there's all these apps that are out there now. So it's just growing. And I
yeah,
think which is great because this is how it should be with food and beverage. The better, the higher quality your product, you should ultimately win out. And now we're basically democratizing that science so anybody can test and see what's in their stuff. So great work. Congratulations on all the growth. Just to close, would love to hear just in short your longer term vision with Seatopia and what you're planning to do with the company.
Um, I'd like to just finish off one more comment on the supplement thing because that does lead into the longer term conversation. Because when you think about what makes a great partnership with our farm partners, it's not just selling center cut frozen fillets, right? Because that's one piece of the fish. There's so many more pieces. It's like the full utilization. And there are marine supplements that are absolutely symbiotic to also selling the fish. So, like, some people don't want to eat fish skins. Like, we sell a lot of skin off fillets. Well, we can do a lot of really cool things in developing supplements and shelf stable products, but also supplements from those fish skins, from uh, the scales, from utilization of the whole fish. And then there's also other really cool nutrients that are growing in those environments, whether we're talking about, microalgae, macroalgae. There- As we deepen our relationships with our partners, we're supporting this ecosystem that makes this theory of better farming practices more sustainable, more financially sustainable, right? So I'm excited to have supplements that have real traceability on where those raw materials are coming from and how are they're tested. And that to me feels like a really authentic way to support our partners, help them be more resilient, more financially sustainable, and build this whole food system to be more resilient, more financially sustainable, more long-term ecologically sustainable. And our North Star is just to be the most trusted brand in marine nutrition, because if we do this well, we change this seafood supply chain. It has incredible benefits, not only to our investors but to the world. Like, there are farms that we're working with today that the people who work there are so enthusiastically grateful and treat us like family because we are honestly making a huge difference in how those businesses operate. There's real living systems and real people that are benefiting because we are changing the incentive structure. And being on the blue planet, like you can't underestimate the impact of changing the seafood supply chain. This is the potentially the biggest lever for ecosystem change on the blue planet, and the potential to shift it even 1% has outsized return on most other categories. Like if we can fix this, it can have a huge impact. And so I'm just super focused on that, and I think about ButcherBox doing 700 million or whatever, and how they've changed the cattle industry and beef and chicken. It's good. We're doing that, and we are also optimizing for nutrient density, and we're deepening our relationships with individual farms and helping develop better products and building a brand. And that's all just feels really good, and an example of the impact that we're having beyond just like it feels good and that they're more financially sustainable and making money. Like we're quantifiably increasing biodiversity in these environments. Like we planted 20,000 kelp trees this year in one of these mangrove reforestation projects that we're doing. Did I, did I say kelp tree? I meant mangroves. Mangrove forests are being reforested because of the projects that we're doing to raise shrimp in a healthier environment. Last year, we did a kelp project and built our own kelp forest, planted over 20,000 kelp. This year, we are crushing it with the mangrove projects. And the whole month of April, I believe for every order, we're planting an additional mangrove. So it's integrated. It's not just a CSR project. Like literally, these are food systems that are reducing dependency on wild bait fish and supporting ecosystem restoration while feeding people something that's delicious and makes them feel super confident in the kitchen to feed their kids and their babies and their family and look like a badass when they do sushi night with their friends.
Precisely not why I buy it. I buy it for my kids. They don't care what I look like and think I'm a loser anyways. But but no, it's always awesome connecting with you and learning more about what you're building. You've kind of got the do you know the term ikagi, or it's a Japanese term where like everything is centered. You have meaning in the environment, you have personal meaning, you're driving profit, changing an industry. I think there's so much to get behind here, and it's a fascinating story arc if you look at the bigger picture of seafood supply, where it is today in the US, even versus other countries, and where we can go with it. So, I hope this turns into an annual podcast. We should just have you on once a year just to check in
Let's
and
do it.
see how you're doing. But yeah, congrats.
Thank you.
Absolutely a big fan of what you're doing. And yeah, we can end here and you can get back to work, I would say. But unless you have a closing statement.
No, man, I got a busy day, but I'm really grateful that we made time to connect. I really appreciate you. It's great to develop rapport over years like this. This is very meaningful, and I'm glad that you're on this adventure with us and that your family loves Seatopia. And even if they don't think you're cool, I appreciate what you're doing, brother.
Thank you, James. All right. Good catching up. Be well.
Okay. Aloha.